impact of this global crisis of capitalism, of the impact of the COVID pandemic, how that's affected the working class, the reaction of the ruling class. And today we'll be dealing with the issue of the upcoming US presidential elections, which are taking place in a few days' time. And we're very pleased to announce and welcome back to our show Howie Hawkins and Angela Walker, who are running on the Green ticket as presidential and vice presidential candidates, putting a socialist, putting an alternative to Trump and also to Biden. So we welcome them to our show, along with Tanya, who's here from the Independent Socialist Group. And of course, we have a couple of days to go before this unprecedented election campaign. And even in the last few days, you've seen incredible scenes coming out of the developments in the US. You've never had such a polarized campaign. Reports on Al Jazeera, BBC, that in Washington, they're boarding up the shops and the local businesses for fear of violence breaking out. You've had in North Carolina, the march to vote, particularly of the black population there, escorted by armed groups to protect them from the white supremacists and the reactionary militias which are developed there. An unprecedented position, which is of historical significance. And of course, it's how this election is going to come out. It's going to shape events both in the US and indeed internationally. So maybe to explore the developments and the potential developments for this election and what's going to take place after the election, we'd like to welcome the three participants to our panel, as I say, and maybe we could begin with Howie and Angela, and if you could maybe outline what is the current situation of the campaign around the Trump campaign, about the Biden campaign, and how has the Green campaign gone thus far?
Well, what we're saying is we're for Medicare for all, and Trump and Biden are opposed. We're for a full-strength Green New Deal, and Trump and Biden are opposed. We're for getting out of these endless wars, and Trump and Biden are opposed. We're for stopping the deployment of these new destabilizing strategic and tactical nuclear weapons, and Trump and Biden are opposed. So we're saying to progressives, vote for what you want. Don't get lost in the sauce and vote for Biden, and then they don't know what you want. You have voted for Biden, who's opposed to what you want. And with the core Green voters, I think, people are holding the line on that. The broader progressive movement has bought the line that we got to pile up the vote to stop Trump from staging a coup. Now, I think we're going to have a fight over making sure the mail-in ballots are counted. We're at something like half the potential electorate is already voted by mail-in ballots. So that's going to be a battle. But so that's kind of where, the voting is going. And, we're already thinking about what happens after the campaign. And we're going to keep our campaign organization together, keep pushing for our issues, some of which I just mentioned. But I think what we want to emphasize more than we did during the campaign are democracy reforms, because we have massive voter suppression by the Republicans, purging voter rolls, photo ID, all these ways to stop people that are likely Democratic voters, like Black people, from voting. But the Democrats have been suppressing the Green Party, which is authoritarian as can be. I mean, running for office is the fullest expression of our First Amendment rights to free speech and petitioning the government for redress of grievances and freedom of the press to the extent we get covered. So we got to have fair ballot access. As we went through the fights over ballot access, it was strictly partisan voting by the Democrats and Republicans on election boards, election commissions, and the courts. The laws and the fact didn't matter. It was partisan hacks voting their, what they thought would help them. Democrats want us off the ballot, Republicans want us on. The irony is most of our voters wouldn't vote for either party if we're not on the ballot. We know that from exit polls. So they're not even dealing with the real issues. We need ranked choice voting and proportional representation. We need public campaign finance with publicly sponsored debates that include the viable candidates. We need universal voter registration, so then the voter roll purges can't happen and voters have, a legal tool to make sure they can vote. There's a whole agenda there that I think we're going to have to emphasize going forward, because we're going to lose a lot of ballot lines in this election. And in this country, it's much harder to get on the ballot than other countries. Just for example, you want to run for Congress without a ballot line as an independent in the US. In most states, it takes thousands or tens of thousands of signatures. If you want to do that in the UK for the House of Commons, it takes 10 signatures. I mean, and then we have partisan administration of our elections rather than an independent agency. So you get these partisan hacks, treating the Green Party like a pawn on their chessboard. So we got a lot of issues right there that we'll be emphasizing going forward.
No, and Angela, I mean, the reports we see is obviously that Biden is ahead in most of the polls. I mean, it looks like Trump's in quite serious trouble at this stage.
For me, and we spoke about it briefly before we started the program. I voted, I was one of those contested voters in Florida in the year 2000. And I was also a voter in Wisconsin in 2012 with the unsuccessful attempt to recall then Governor Scott Walker. In both of these cases, there was rampant chicanery happening around, the whole process. And the people were not listened to. So I have a lot of reservations about how November 3rd is going to go, and how the counting of mail-in ballots, in this year that is so unprecedented in so many ways because of COVID, how that's going to be handled, particularly in Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities.
Yeah, so I mean, even if Biden is ahead, you can have a real battleground open up, literally, in terms of even getting the votes counted. But it seems that the ruling class in general in the US, the capitalist class, have had enough of Trump. They don't trust him. He's a little bit out of control. And that is undoubtedly reflected also with the anti-Trump mood, which is developing in the main urban areas. So how's the end of the campaign appearing? Tanya, have you any thoughts on that?
Thanks. I think you're absolutely right that the capitalist class has, by and large, abandoned Trump at this point. Even though Trump championed their interest with his 2017 tax bill and the corporate COVID bailout, at this point, he's seen as too unpredictable and destabilizing by the capitalist class, and really unable to sort of pull the US back from the brink of social explosion that we're currently on. And so I think we see that reflected in Biden's lead in fundraising among billionaires. And in fact, and all households who make over $100,000, Biden is leading dramatically. And so the polls have Biden winning the election pretty handily. And I think that is likely. But again, as Howie and Angela have gone into, I think that the counting of the vote and voter suppression are going to be a huge problem. And I do think it's going to be days, if not longer, before we even know the results of the election. So.
Yeah, so it could be drawn out. And that's a point maybe if we could come back and feature that a little bit more, Howie. I mean, how likely is it, do you think, that Trump will simply roll over and accept the result? You have the militias in the area, in local areas rather, and he's called on them to be ready to be deployed, which they probably will be. But how serious a threat is that? And of course, what do you think is the position not only with the capitalist class but within the American state machine, not just the local police, ICE forces, and the border forces? But what's the real position in the main areas of the U.S. state machine, the military, the secret services, etc.?
Well, I'm a former Marine. I've been talking with former Marines, my American Legion Post members, and one of those Marines has people he knows in the Secret Service. There's no way these ragtag white militias can challenge the U.S. state. They can cause mayhem. They can kill people. They can, get people all worried. I think, but, just as a military matter, a lot of these former military people would just love to go out and take care of them. So the bigger problem is counting the vote. And the Democrats have an army of lawyers ready to go to court, but we've seen how that's worked out in the past. Like in 2000, they called the people saying count the vote off the streets while the Republicans stayed on the streets and had their little riots and broke into some places where they're counting and turned over tables and scattered the ballots. And eventually the Supreme Court gave it to Bush, who was the loser of the popular vote. So the Democrats seem more interested in the legitimacy of the system than its integrity. We saw that in 2016. It was the Green Party that called for a counting of over 70,000 votes in Detroit, predominantly Black. Most of them would have voted for Clinton, and their votes weren't counted because the Republican Secretary of State put in defective scanners. So those ballots were set aside, never counted. So when they got to court, the judge said, well, Greens, you don't have standing because if you won all those votes, you still wouldn't win Michigan. But the Clinton lawyers were in the courtroom, and the judge turned to them and said, do you want to get in? And they said, oh, no, we're just observing. They could have flipped Michigan. So it seems to me Clinton was more interested in the integrity of the system, the legitimacy of the system, rather than rocking the boat to protect its integrity. And of course, then they turn around and say we spoiled the election. We had the same thing in Ohio in 2004, where John Kerry basically told, it was a Green lawyer, Bob Fitrakis, said, if you can fix this in 3 days, okay, but otherwise, I'm not in. So the danger is the Democrats won't fight to have the vote counted anymore. They'll do their court briefings and their arguments, but if they lose, they're going to accept it, which means we got to be out in the streets. Now, I think the most encouraging thing is that starting with the Labor Council, just 60 miles from where I'm at in Rochester, New York, they called on the AFL-CIO to prepare a general strike if there's a problem with counting the vote. And the Seattle Labor Council, the San Francisco Labor Council, Sarah Nelson of the flight attendants, who's played a prominent role in getting relief for the airline industry, have all been in on the conversation, and Trump has talked to these labor councils. So there's some motion there. And really, that's where our strength is. If they don't count the vote, the country doesn't run. And that'll move to people because business wants to do business. And if we're not working, they can't do anything. So I think that's our strength. And we may have to use it to make sure the vote is counted.
Yeah, and that's a really important and significant development. What the leadership nationally of the AFL-CIO does in terms of calling a general strike, but the very fact that that's been put into the mix for debate is highly significant in terms of what can develop in organised labour and amongst the working class if Trump overreaches his hand. Now, there is another aspect of this that we've seen in the run-up to the election campaign. You saw the marvellous movement around the Black Lives Matter, which really was a social uprising, but the killings are carried on. And we've seen that in Philadelphia recently, provoking more protests and movement. And our understanding is you've had an infiltration of the police, partly by the white supremacists. They're in there. And even under Biden, that's not going to stop. But maybe Angela has a few comments you'd like to say on what has happened in Philadelphia and elsewhere, because, despite this massive movement, the right have just continued with their racist attacks.
I want to lift up the name of Walter Wallace Jr. When we're speaking about Philadelphia, lift him up and lift up his family, who are enduring the unimaginable, which is not unimaginable in this country. And I would gently push back that it isn't just, I don't think that police departments in this country are infiltrated by white racists. I think they're built by them. I think they're sustained by them. What is happening to Black people in this country is built into the system of this country. The first job of policing in this country was to catch runaway enslaved people and return them to slavery. And so what we're seeing is the continuing devaluation of Black life because it is built into the system and built into the way that this country works. And if we are going to honestly do the work to change the way that, change what's happening, there has to be political will, which there is not. There's a bunch of tokenism and, topical reforms and pacification techniques, but no one is but us is being honest about the fact that it is the system that has to change. The capitalist exploitation of human beings and its impact on Black people is the thing that has to be ceased, and the white supremacy that makes it happen. And so that is the thing that is going to have to happen. And neither one of the parties that are representing the mainstream are interested in making those changes. It's not going to happen.
No, but you see that, I think you've hit the nail on the head there, Angela, in terms of this is a struggle, not just against Trump. It's really a struggle against the whole of the capitalist system, which is involved here, dealing with a struggle against racism, a struggle against the horrific economic conditions which are existing now for the working class throughout the whole of the United States. And that's going to come to the fore after the election, because this economic crisis that we're confronted with in the US, as indeed is the case internationally, it's the worst since the 1930s. I mean, the figures that are coming out of the US in terms of the poverty, frankly, are mind-blowing. The figures that we're getting here in Europe, that by the end of this year, 54 million US citizens are going to be suffering food shortages, in the sense they're not going to have enough food every day of the week to feed their families. I mean, this is the richest, most powerful imperialist country on the planet. And you have 50 more million people don't have enough food. I mean, that is taking us back to the position of the 1930s. Now, let us presume, as seems most likely, even after a battle over the vote counting, that we have a Biden presidency. What is Biden's program? How is Biden, if indeed he's able to, going to be able to resolve the problems facing the mass of the working population in the United States? How are they going to be able to do that? And does he offer anything in terms of being able to alleviate the poverty and get out of the economic recession that we face? So maybe Howie and then Angela and Tanya could have a few comments on that, about Biden's economic policy, what a Biden presidency will mean.
Well, Biden's main platform is he's not Trump. When you think of Joe Biden, there's no particular issue he's the champion of. He's got this vague program about Build Back Better, and you look at the details to the extent he's provided them, and it's the same old trickle-down economics, which is Trump's policy, and that is you give tax breaks and subsidies to the big corporations and the super rich, and theoretically they're going to invest in new factories and businesses and create jobs. But with demand down, I mean, people can't afford to put food on their table. They take that extra money and they make financial investments. They buy stocks and bonds and commodities and real estate and just rearrange who owns and further concentrate who owns the productive assets we already have. And that's been, the policy of both parties through the whole, what we call the neoliberal era, which means market discipline for the working class and state support for the ruling class. And Biden is very much a part of that. His whole history. He was a key author of what they call Reagan's tax cuts, which was also massive social program cuts. He was part of the Democratic Leadership Conference, the corporate conservative wing of the Democratic Party, what Jesse Jackson used to call Democrats for the leisure class. He was a big supporter of Bill Clinton, his crime bill, his Telecommunications Act, repeal of Glass-Steagall. And he's represented a state is where, Trump had Michael Cohen set up an LLC to pay off his bimbos because the corporations chartered in that state are so little regulated. It's also the state of the DuPont chemical industry and the credit card industry. And Biden was part of taking away from students the right to go bankrupt if their student debt is killing them. So this is the man who's going to be the next president. So what it means for working people is get ready, because there's no relief coming. There will be token gestures. They will pass particularly social legislation, like there's an Equality Act pending, which will give people protection under federal anti-discrimination laws based on their sexual orientation and gender identity. So there'll be those kind of reforms, and they'll tout those. But when it comes to the economic class issues, the foreign policy issues, and the environmental issues, there's not going to be much difference from what we saw with Trump. It'll just be packaged a lot more palatably for the public.
Yeah, no, that's devastating. Angela, have you got any other points you'd like to develop on that? How you see that Biden's economic policies?
Just to tack on to what Howie is saying, I mean, Joe Biden has gone on record saying, if he's elected, nothing is going to change. So, he's not interested in the type of economic, basically revolution that's required to bring us out of what we're in this country, and the dire economic situation that a whole lot of folks are facing. Evictions and food shortages and lack of access to medical, which we're not even going to get into because we have no medical infrastructure. He's not going to change anything, and I think it's very important that people who are concerned about things like climate change, he's not going to move on climate change. He's already said that. The Biden plan, but you're still, you're rejoining the Paris Accords. That's cute, but you're not going to ban fracking, which is a major cause of climate change. Things like that. So, there's not a lot of optimism around any plan that he's touting, because I really haven't heard one.
No. As you both say, I mean, he may get a few token points, and maybe get another stimulus package, but the question is, what effect is that really going to have, and where's it going to be directed? Then I don't know if Tanya has any points about how you would see the consequences of a Biden presidency.
Right. So I think a Biden presidency, and I think that Howie and Angela have already really spoken to this well, in that he's not really offering much to begin with. And so with Obama in 2008, he actually ran on what at least sounded like some good progressive policies, universal health care, expanded union rights, immigration reform, closing Guantanamo. Now, what we saw with Obama was broken promises. We didn't get any of the things that he said we would get. With Biden, I think we can expect the same, which is broken promises. And so to the extent that he has offered the working class anything, he has a very mild college affordability plan, for example. I think we'll see broken promises there too. But as Howie and Angela went into, he hasn't promised much. And so again, opposes Medicare for all during a pandemic, supports fracking during a climate meltdown, wants to arrest protesters, and is more concerned about looting when there's anti-racist, anti-police brutality uprising going on. And so, and we can't forget his history as vice president under Obama. He helped oversee the Wall Street bailout, and completely left regular working Americans out in the cold with the foreclosure crisis and job losses. I can't see how we can expect anything different this time. And I think ultimately his goal is going to be to restore stability for the capitalist class, stability for their investments, but not anything that working people need. So we won't get student debt forgiveness. We won't get Medicare for all or the universal healthcare system that we need. And, I do agree, I think, with something Howie said. I think he will offer some concessions. I agree. There's likely to be some sort of social reforms, protections offered, which is good, of course. And I think that we, may get another stimulus check, for example. In the US, all we've gotten for the whole pandemic is one $1,200 stimulus check, and a lot of people didn't get that. So a few crumbs and not much else.
No, so I mean, of course, when he comes into power, assuming he wins, you may get an initial period of people having a little bit of expectation, and maybe probably more accurate is from what Howie said, that the main thing he's got going for him is the fact he's not Trump. There could be a sense of relief for a period that Trump's defeated. So the issue then is Trump's defeated, but does that really mean that that's the end of Trumpism? They've largely still got control of the Republican Party. You see the development still of the militias. You have other Republican senators, like the guy from Arkansas, is it Tom Cotton, who presents himself as tries to present himself as a more intelligent Trump, which is not, I suppose, that difficult. But, is it going to be the end of Trumpism, given the scale of this social crisis, if Trump's defeated? I don't know what you think about that, Howie.
Well, I think Trumpism is the current expression of a long political tradition in this country of white supremacism, the people that overthrew the Reconstruction governments in the South violently to restore, the power of the planters, but now the capitalists from the North that were coming down, and ruled the country that way with, the Democratic coalition of Dixiecrats and Northern liberals. And then they switched to the Republican Party. And that's what Trump expresses. The good thing is, I think demographically, they're much smaller than they once were. Example I like is, Nixon with his, law and order, silent majority, dog whistle, racist campaign, the Southern strategy in '68. He won, but Wallace, between the two of them, they got 55% of the vote. Now it's, Trump at best gets 45 and sometimes is having trouble getting 40% approval. So they're the political minority. The problem is the Democrats, and particularly the ruling class behind them, the two-party system is what gives us the illusion of choice and the legitimacy for the system. So I could see the Democrats propping up the Republican Party. Bill Clinton, when the Republicans got some strength, called it triangulation. Joe Biden calls it working across the aisle. The Obama-Biden administration knocked themselves out just to get one Republican to vote for their stimulus, which was mostly tax cuts, not direct benefits for working people, or to get, for their healthcare plan was the old Republican plan. And they couldn't even get the Republicans to vote for that, but they bent themselves over backwards to try to do that. And that's Joe Biden's history. Going back to when he used to pal around with Strom Thurmond, arch segregationists, who against busing for school desegregation. And it wasn't the busing they opposed, because students were being bused all over the place. It was desegregation. So, that's Joe Biden, and I'm afraid they're not going to fight the Republicans. They're going to kind of prop them up, because the two-party system is how, the people that run this country get legitimacy. So it looks like, real contest. But on the big issues that the rich care about, economics, foreign policy, environmental policy, they're on the same page, basically.
Mm-hmm. No, I think you raised a very important point there, Howie, and that is the question of the demographics, the decline of the base. It doesn't mean it's not significant, and it's not an issue that the left and the working class has to be prepared to face up to. But the shift in the demographic makeup is very important, and the change in attitude from young people, which is key in terms of what's coming. I mean, the fact that in the opinion polls you now have amongst youth, the idea of socialism is now more popular than capitalism. I mean, maybe on a bit of a confused basis. And this morning I was listening to a podcast from the London Review of Books with an interesting American academic, Mike Davis, and he was explaining, he's justifying voting for Biden, by the way, and he was explaining how he's tried to speak to his teenage children and their friends, and why they should vote for Biden when they don't have the vote, as he explains. And he described it, he said it was like a Menshevik speaking to an audience of Bolsheviks. That generation, their whole attitude was different. They want a complete system change, which is underlines the point, I think, that you're making in terms of the future, particularly for young people. Now, maybe if we could come back to an issue that you touched on earlier, and that is the issue of the total lack of democracy, which has been transparently exposed in this election campaign, and the difficulties that a new Workers' Party or left party would face to really develop an electoral position at least. And it's been reflected in this campaign. And I think you, Howie, in an article that you wrote recently, you drew out some of the points. I think it's in 3 states the Greens have been ruled out by the Democrats. And if I remember rightly, you wrote that in New York, they've tripled the votes needed for the Greens to get on the ballot line for the next election. And that's the Democrats. So that's a key issue, which you touched on earlier. Maybe you could develop some of those points a bit further.
Yeah, well, we're going to have to regroup after this campaign because it looks like we're going to have less ballot lines coming out than we went in because we're going to get a lower percentage. You know, in about 40 of the 50 states, the vote we get determines whether we have a ballot line for the next election cycle. And in most states, it's 1, 2, 3, or 5%. So it's going to be tough. So the thing we can do in this country is run for local office and win because we have 500,000 elected officers in this country. Most of them are local. Those are races where you can knock on doors, introduce yourself to people. People respect that. And the Democrats and Republicans don't do that because most of these districts, because of gerrymandering, are one-party districts. And so once you get the designation of your party, you don't really have to campaign. And that's why Greens, to the extent we've done it, we win about 1/3 of our local races. That can be replicated in the thousands, and that can build a foundation for challenging in state legislatures and Congress. I think that's the way forward. But, you know, we've got a campaign going forward for these democracy reforms. We should have a federal standard for fair ballot access instead of 51 different laws in 51 different jurisdictions, 50 states and the District of Columbia. We should have universal voter registration so that it's the government responsible for keeping the voter rolls, and they can't just purge the rolls with by dubious means, like your name is the same as someone who was a felon, and so they knock you off too, where felons can't vote. So I think that's got to be a key thing we can move going forward. And the game changer is to get ranked choice voting, not just for single executive offices, but for multi-member districts for legislative offices. Because then we get proportional representation. And ranked choice voting has been adopted by 23 cities and counties in this country. By the state of Maine, the presidential election, the electors will be allocated by ranked choice voting. It's on the ballot in the states of Massachusetts and Alaska. I think it's an idea whose time has come, and it's something the left can really push, I think, because I think it has momentum, and that makes it easier for us to compete. It eliminates the spoiler problem, which is the Democrats, you know, they always tell you, well, you got to vote for us because the Republicans are so bad. And a lot of people buy into that. You get ranked choice voting, that's not a problem. So I think that needs to be a key part of what the left is doing in the next period.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, obviously, there's a whole issue of the Supreme Court as well. I mean, the whole issue of that and the undemocratic makeup of the Senate. I mean, it's staggering in terms of how undemocratic that is. I don't know if Angela has any points to develop on those crucial issues.
No, just thinking about, you know, how he covered it pretty well. You know, just thinking about the effect that it's had on people. I think this election cycle versus previous election cycles, I think people may have been aware that these things happen in some nebulous way. But, you know, with this campaign, it seems to me that people are like, you know, people in my family are like questioning because we were pushed off the ballot in Wisconsin, which is my home state. And the Democratic Party in Wisconsin, these people actually know exactly who I am. They know me. And so, you know, I think it opened up a lot of people's eyes to the barriers that third parties are fighting in this country, and that we really democracy in the United States is good for sloganeering and things like that. But when it comes to like actually having some substance, we do not have a democracy. We never really have. And I think people, through what has happened with us and how high profile that has been this campaign cycle, I think that they're aware of it now. And I think that will help us going forward, that people can see it.
Yeah. So the land of the free is not necessarily so free. Tanya, I don't know if you have any points you'd like to add to this very important issue.
Well, just a couple short points. One is just to highlight how much voter disenfranchisement there is in this country. So of the 328 million people in the US, 240 million, only 240 million are eligible to vote. And one of the really key sources of voter disenfranchisement is denying felons voting rights, often for life. And that because we have this racist system of mass incarceration disproportionately affects Black and Latino people in the United States. And so that is something that I think we really need to fight for. And also I would just point out the Electoral College is massively undemocratic. Trump lost the popular vote in 2016, but still became president because of the sort of vagaries of the Electoral College. And so I think getting rid of the Electoral College, and then, of course, other things that you got into about the Supreme Court, incredibly undemocratic also. So I totally agree with Angela. We don't live in a democracy here, despite all the rhetoric.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you'd have no choice but in that situation but to demand the abolition of the Supreme Court and really the Senate as well. I mean, for our international viewers who may not be aware, if you look at the composition of the Senate, in Wyoming, which I believe is the smallest state in the US, or one of the smallest states, it has a population of less than 1 million, they get 2 senators. And California, with a population of 40 million, also get 2 senators. It's a measure of how completely undemocratic the whole system is. So there's just 2 other issues that I think it would be very good for our viewers if you could touch on. One is the issue of international policy, and the other is where we go after the election in the role of the left and what tasks are going to be posed post the election, particularly under a Biden presidency. But firstly, on the issue of its international policy under Biden, what is the international policy he's putting forward? Because Trump's gone from a more protectionist position, a more nationalist position in the sense of pulling back, isolationist position, if you want to put it like that. I think you get the impression Biden's talking about he's going to be more aggressively against the Chinese and Russians than what Trump has been. He may go for a policy of trying to reassert to an extent or try to reassert US influence internationally, where Trump has pulled back somewhat. The question is, what can they do with that? I mean, after Iraq, it's very difficult to see a situation where they're going to be able to have direct military interventions a la Iraq, but they may try to reassert a certain influence of US imperialism. But how far can they go for that, particularly against the background of the rising position of China at this stage? But I don't know if Howie and Angela and Tanya has a view on that, because it's an important question. How's Biden going to react, for example, to the victory of the MAS in Bolivia?
Well, I think the national security state's been on automatic pilot while Trump has been president. Trump is lazy. He's ignorant. He doesn't know what they're doing. And then he kind of gets in the way, like when Erdogan says, please get out of the way so we can invade northern Syria. Trump says, okay, because he's more interested in his business interests in Istanbul than he is about the Kurds, who are just the cannon fodder to fight ISIS, with us providing their support. So I don't think things will change. Biden definitely has some positions. He's an advocate for lower profile of conventional troops and more emphasis on drone strikes and special operations, snatch and snuff actions. And we're currently engaged with combat troops in 14 conflicts. Most of them are not large scale like the Iraq invasion was, but they run from the Philippines to Cameroon and Africa. And I think Biden is very much committed to those things. When they had a quote unquote constitutional coup in Honduras in 2009, where they grabbed the president who had the temerity to raise the minimum wage in his pajamas and shipped him out of the country, like they'd done to Aristide in his pajamas and flew him to Africa, earlier. Biden, supported that. So I think nothing much is going to change in terms of U.S. imperialism under Biden. In fact, it may be more effective because he's been part of that for his whole political career. I mean, when he was head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he was the Democrat that rallied Democrats to Bush's invasion of Iraq. So I don't think there's going to be much change from the Biden administration in that regard. And it's a shame because this country doesn't have a strong peace movement. And they didn't vote in large numbers, or probably won't for, our ticket, which has been trying to raise these issues. I mean, our policy is 75% cut in military spending, get out of these endless wars, start withdrawing from over 800 foreign military bases, pledge no first use of nuclear weapons, and then go to the other nuclear powers, particularly Russia and China, which have followed us in modernizing their nuclear forces, and say we want complete and mutual nuclear disarmament, and do it on the basis of this new treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. We would have world public opinion behind us. But you'll never get that from a Trump administration. I mean, that's the kind of thing we need to build a movement around and convince the American people that this huge military budget and all these wars is not about the peace and security of us. It's about the security of US-based global corporations and banks and their interests overseas. And, we shouldn't be fighting for them. And it undermines the peace and security of the world. So we say, let's use US wealth to be the world's humanitarian superpower. Let's provide aid instead of arms. Let's have a global Green New Deal and help the global South leap out of the 19th century fossil fuel age into the 21st century solar age and make friends instead of enemies. That'll do a lot more for peace and security. But we need to build a movement around that because right now, the military industrial complex is just taking care of business without any opposition. I think emblematic of that is when Trump had Juan Guaido, the man that the U.S. wants to install as president in Venezuela, in the gallery during the State of the Union address. And when he acknowledged him, all the Democrats gave him a standing ovation as well as the Republicans. That's where we're at.
And Angela and Tanya, if you'd like to supplement or raise any other points you think are relevant about the crucial issue of the international policy of Biden.
I think that Howie pretty much said everything that I would say. We have a lot of amends to make in the world, in the this idea of American exceptionalism, where we're number one. We can you have something under your sand or in your mountains or under your soil. We want it. We come take it. It hasn't done us any favors. And, quite frankly, the world community is a little bit tired of it. So I think that we're in a position, that change is not going to happen. I'm just thinking, Biden was vice president under a president who increased drone strikes in primarily Black and brown countries around the world and targeted drone strikes of some people who were actually American citizens. So I under a Biden administration, we may as well be moving the same way as we are with this current administration.
Okay, and Tanya, I don't know if you anything you'd like to add?
Just to add quickly that as you mentioned, Biden has claimed that he would be even more confrontational towards China than Trump. He wants to outspend Trump on the military. So I think it's clear that the Democrats will maintain and possibly even expand imperialism going forward under a Biden presidency. And I think this is a huge blind spot of the progressive left in this country, many of whose leaders are throwing their support behind Biden and really just abandoning the rest of the world consideration. So that's all I have.
Right. Well, the final point that I think we should address in this discussion is the question is, where do we go on the left, those looking for a socialist alternative after the election, particularly assuming Biden wins the presidency? Even if Trump squeaks through, then the same issue will be posed. How do we proceed in terms of building what the US situation is crying out for, indeed the global situation is crying out for, the need for new mass workers' socialist parties to offer a real alternative? And do you see this campaign that you've had, Howie and Angela, and the Independent Socialist Group who supported them in the course of this campaign has possibly laid the basis, at least to group together people and a force that could, post-election, begin to conduct a serious campaign to build something new to offer a real alternative to all of the working class of the US. Howie, maybe we could start. You'd like to start responding to that.
Well, we intend to follow up with the groups that supported us, which you mentioned: Independent Socialist Group, Socialist Alternative, some local chapters of DSA, and some groups like Student Loan Justice, Legal Marijuana Now Party in Minnesota, and the Greens. I think we need to, and the Socialist Party USA, we're their nominees as well as the Green parties. And we should have some discussions about how we can build a broader, united, independent left. And given the political structure of the United States, it's going to be different in different states because these different groups have different strengths in different states. But that's really trying to get on the same page to do what we need to do, which is to organize. We can't just mobilize. In this country, people tend to go out and preach to people that they want to get involved. Here's the leaflet, here's the demonstration, show up. And the biggest group of people in this election are going to be the people that didn't vote in all likelihood. And that's predominantly working class people, people of color, and young people. And if we show up, and tell them, come to the demonstration, their attitude toward us is, well, like, who are you? We got to get in these communities and listen and organize, build relationships and trust, and organizations that these people can participate in. So that means, grassroots chapters of a mass party. And that, to me, is the most important thing. The left, as a child of the new left, 1960s, I think we got overly impressed with what we could do with street mobilizations in civil rights and anti-Vietnam War. And we did have legitimate criticisms of the old left. They were slow on feminism, environmental issues, but they did know how to build mass organizations, and we haven't been doing that for decades. So I think organizing is the key. We can get all the left organizations together, and we're still very small. But the future of an independent left are the people that have mostly been disengaged. And they're not apathetic, they're alienated. They don't participate because they feel powerless, and they think the two parties don't know them, care about them, know what their issues are. And that's a vacuum that we can fill on the left. So I think we got to become real organizers and go out and listen and build relationships in local organizations. And then we'll have a base that can contest for power.
Okay, and Angela, would you like to have any closing remarks?
Yeah, building community is absolutely crucial to this effort. And, what we saw at the beginning of this pandemic, when the state was failing to provide people personal protective equipment, we saw leftists, we saw anarchists, we saw socialists, we saw communists, we saw people making hand sanitizer and making sure that homeless people or houseless folks had it. We saw people distributing food. We saw people working to make sure that people had safe places to shelter. We saw our own, our folks were in the street doing this. And those things, I think, are going to be crucial to our efforts going forward, is the community building, that Howie is also talking about. Is we're going to have to help, with the mutual aid efforts. And we're going to have to do skill shares and, book studies and, get together on Zoom and like hash out theory and understand our history as leftists in this country, because a whole lot of people don't. The left has a very strong history, particularly with Black, brown, and indigenous people. We know how to do this. And so I think the education piece is going to be crucial. Community building is absolutely going to be crucial. Because it's a proven fact. You work harder for and with the people you actually know, that are working alongside you. So I think those things are going to be very crucial to how we are moving forward.
Yep, and of course, and Tanya, maybe to give you the final word on this important issue of where now.
So I think that if Biden does win this election, which it looks like he will, there's going to be a temptation on the broader progressive left of the US population to take it easy and to give Biden a chance and sort of sleep easy, knowing that Trump has been defeated. But as I hope has been clear through this conversation, we have a lot to fight for under Biden. And democracy, participating in democracy, is really a lot more than just voting. We want everyone to vote. Socialists should advocate for the working class to use its democratic rights to vote as much as possible. But that's sort of the first step, right? And so what we really need in order to win the policies and the programs and the reforms and the system change that we so desperately need, we have to get organized, and we need to build a mass progressive left alternative to the two corporate parties. And this is something that can't spring up overnight. We can't wait 4 more years to build this. We need to be building it now. Through the Hawkins and Walker campaign, that can be a first step, I think, absolutely. And so, I think that's also the Democratic Party has been able to capture the vote of progressives and leftists and rely on it. And they have no motivation under that scenario to put forward actual progressive policies, because they can almost do what they want as long as they're not as bad as the Republicans, and still get people's votes. And so again, the way to actually win these policies that we need is to build a real alternative left party. And that's going to be hard work. And I think Howie and Angela talked about some of the steps towards doing that. I'd be remiss if I didn't say to join the Independent Socialist Group. If you're in the United States, we are working on that project always. So that's what I have.
Okay, and just to continue that theme, I understand, Tanya, you've got a meeting post-election coming up. So maybe you'd just like to make a few points on that. It's being showed currently at the link of where that is, and the details of that at the bottom of our screen today. So I don't know if Tanya would like to just say a few words about that very briefly.
Yeah, so the Independent Socialist Group is having an online meeting on November 12th at 7 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time to discuss the results of the election and where to go next as socialists, what our next step should be. Okay, well, thanks very much for that. And I'd like to thank Howie
Angela and Tanya for joining us today, which I think has been a very informative discussions, a few days running up to the presidential elections in the United States. And of course, we would appeal to all of our viewers, anybody watching in the US, if you're not already in touch or members of the Independent Socialist Group, to punch that into the internet. You'll get their website. You can put yourself in contact with them there. If you're watching internationally, don't stay passive. Join us in the Committee for a Workers' International in the struggle for building an international socialist alternative. You can go to our website at socialistworld.net. You can follow us on Twitter at CWI Socialist. You can follow us on Instagram at Socialist World. And in particular, you can subscribe to us on our YouTube channel at CWI Media. So we'd appeal to you to join us in the struggle. We need your support. If you're prepared to make a financial donation, that would be great, because we have no big business backers. We rely on donations of workers and young people from around the world. So we'd appeal to you to help us in the struggle. In the meantime, let's continue this struggle globally. We thank our three guests today. If you like what you've heard from Howie, if you'd like to hear him again, if you're in the UK or indeed internationally, he'll be speaking at the England and Wales Socialist Party Socialism 2021 rally at the end of November. You can go onto the Socialist Party website and get more information about that. So in the meantime, stay safe, keep struggling, and we'll be back, I hope, next week when we'll have a little bit of a balance sheet of the outcome of this crucial presidential election in the US. So thanks for watching, and good luck in this continuing struggle for a socialist alternative.